Episode 6 Europe in the Time of the Mongols. Question 1. How does the Fourth Crusade illustrate the dual impulses of religion and commerce in Europe? What does it tell us about the divide between Eastern and Western Christianity? In 1204 CE, a crusader force from the west, in theory on the way to bolster the Christian territory around Jerusalem, changed course and attacked and looted the ancient city of Constantinople, despite it being a Christian city located 1,000 miles from Jerusalem. This was in part a response to an attack on Catholic Christians that had occurred just before the crusade launched. It would be disingenuous, however, to assert an entirely altruistic motive on the part of the Crusaders, who, incidentally, had been financed by the city-state of Venice, then the commercial capital of the Western world. When the Crusaders were unable to pay the Venetians, they also sacked the Christian city of Zara and gave the proceeds to the Venetians as recompense. The episodes severely worsened relations between Western and Eastern Christianity, widening the already substantial gap between the two. For Western Europe, the Fourth Crusade marked a shift in focus from religious liberation to economic interests and political rivalries. Question 2. What is the connection between the invasion of Russia by the Mongols and the rise of Russian feudalism and serfdom? The fortunes of the Russian state in the Middle Ages had always been closely tied to the Byzantine Empire. Russian culture was heavily influenced by Constantinople, due in large part to the Russian adherence to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which had its center in the Byzantine capital. Perhaps more significantly, Russia relied on trade with the Byzantines to sustain its economy. As the Byzantine Empire declined, remember the Fourth Crusade, the Russian economy suffered, and the resulting financial hardships in turn led to political destabilization. Then, between 1237 and 1242 CE, two successive Mongol invasions easily subdued the major Russian cities. The Mongols established their own capital, forcing the surviving Russian nobles to spend time at court and pay various forms of tribute. The Mongols had little political or cultural impact on Russia, one significant exception being the model of authoritarian rule that would be a fundamental aspect of Russian life up until the present day. Many Russian peasants either tried to flee from the Mongol attacks or sought the protection of more powerful landowners. The labor obligation these liberated peasants owed in return for this protection is the core principle of feudalism. As the Mongol grip on Russia loosened, not long after they had seized power, the more powerful Russian nobles, boyars as they would come to be known, fought successfully to expel the invaders. Each advance would liberate new territory and more peasants, adding to the serf population. Thus, the Russian Empire was built on these parallel forces. The empire and its aristocracy were to a large extent born anew amidst military conquest and mass encirclement. Feudal aristocracies all have their origin in the need for a warrior class supported by a subordinate peasant class. Because the empire was in a constant cycle of military expansion and thus peasant liberation, the character of the Russian state would be defined by extraordinary aristocratic privilege and peasant subjugation. Question 3. How does the case of Philip II Augustus illustrate the distribution of power within a feudal state? By the beginning of the Mongol era, important monarchies began to develop in France, Spain, and Britain. Kings had developed complex relationships with leading noble families, many of whom kept their own armies. Small bureaucracies served the king directly, along with a relatively small professional military force, but the kingdoms generally remained decentralized, and the monarch routinely depended on a coalition of nobles for support. In France, for example, the late 12th century monarch King Philip II Augustus used several methods to improve his position as ruler. He expanded the territory under his personal control through a series of military campaigns. He paid non-aristocratic middle-class officials in his administration regarding them as more loyal and more talented than regional nobles. He was able to send some central officials to outlying regions in an attempt to strengthen his presence there, and perhaps most significantly, he used growing tax revenues to hire mercenaries who would serve under his direct command. The link between tax revenue and centralization of authority would become the basis for the later development of absolute monarchies in the age of maritime imperialism. Philip II's efforts represented the model for a more effective centralized government, but still had fundamental limitations. Regional nobles retained a considerable level of independence, and the king was obliged to appoint aristocrats as his military generals. The struggle between the monarch and the aristocracy had as yet no clear outcome. Question 4. Was the development of parliaments in the 13th century a shift towards democracy? Explain. Unsurprisingly, the tug of war between monarchs and nobles over control of the state proceeded asymmetrically in Western Europe. In Spain and Portugal, the wars that saw the Muslim presence in the Iberian Peninsula extinguished necessitated a more centralized power structure that would be later capable of, amongst other things, providing the financial footing that would subsequently support the voyages of discovery. The power of the monarch in these regions was consequently stronger long after its immediate military necessity had faded. Nonetheless, the major monarchies were marked, from the 13th century onwards, by important new limitations on their power. In 1215 CE, powerful nobles in Britain, resenting the efforts of the unpopular King John to try to raise revenues, forced the ruler to sign the Magna Carta. This document carefully limited royal power by requiring permission from the nobles to raise taxes and agreement with the church in the appointment of church officials. The Magna Carta even called for the creation of a council of nobles to serve as a check on the king's power. Later in the 13th century, these principles were more clearly translated into action through the creation of parliaments. However, these developments were still very much in their nascent stages, and the king was still the undisputed leading political force. Ultimately, these bodies were in no way democratic, for they only represented the interests of the upper strata of society. Almost the entire populace of these kingdoms had no say in the political process whatsoever. Question 5. What sort of political institutions developed in Western Europe outside of the big three of Britain, France, and Spain? Most of Western Europe outside of Britain, France, and Spain struggled to organize into even moderately successful centralized power structures. Nominally, Germany was ruled by an emperor, but in practice the region was a patchwork of decentralized states of varying independence, ruled variously by senior clergy, regional nobles, or in some cases, free cities. Similar political disorganization could be seen in the Low Countries and Italy. Italy, in particular, demonstrates the array of differing political structures. In addition to minor regional monarchies and city-states, substantial portions of the Italian peninsula were territories of the Pope. Key Italian city-states began to gain significant new authority from the 13th century onwards, sometimes governed by councils of wealthy merchants, sometimes by a self-appointed ruling family with close ties to the merchant class. Several of these states, enriched by ever-increasing trade revenue, began to introduce new government functions such as patronizing the arts, conducting censuses and other investigations, and even appointing diplomats to represent the cities to other powers. And, of course, city-states sponsored often brutal military campaigns against each other and external foes. Question 6. Why was Thomas Aquinas such an important figure? The Crusades, concurrently with the Mongol invasions of the Middle East, exponentially increased European knowledge of the outside world, most importantly in the field of science. Europe had been, during the classical Greco-Roman era, a center for learning and scientific endeavor, but the retreat eastward of the Roman Empire left Western Europe without the resources for, or interest in pursuing new scientific knowledge. This moratorium slowly began to thaw, beginning with the European exposure to scientific thought from the Muslim world and beyond. The theologian Thomas Aquinas, an Italian monk working in Paris in the 13th century, sought to compile all of the knowledge in the known world in a massive work titled the Summas. Most significantly, Thomas Aquinas synthesized Christian doctrine with classical Aristotelian philosophy, arguing that faith and reason should not inherently be in conflict, that truths revealed by God, faith, and truths discovered by human reason, philosophy and science, are ultimately the same. Aquinas' work made it possible in later years for scientists to pursue knowledge free from accusations of blasphemy and witchcraft. Political and theological conflicts in later years complicated the relationship between church and science. The Catholic Church accepted the work of Thomas Aquinas as canon, but did not allow for any modification or evolution of his findings. The Protestant Reformation would provide an alternate context for scientific discovery, contributing to the scientific revolution beginning in the 16th century. Question 7. How did the decline of legitimate intellectual pursuits in schools and monasteries lead to a flourishing of the arts? Despite the best efforts of Thomas Aquinas and others to reinvigorate intellectual discovery in Western Europe, by the 14th and 15th centuries, no one was pursuing the kind of scientific progress Aquinas had championed, and indeed many religious authorities were now criticizing Aquinas for having given too much credence to reason. Church institutions, once the only bright spots in the relative intellectual murk of the Middle Ages, reverted to a movement known as scholasticism. So named because of its origins in the church-affiliated schools and universities, it was characterized by esoteric and self-referential debates on topics as abstract as the infamous "How many angels can dance on the head of a pin?" Partly because of this intellectual torpor, creative emphasis shifted away from church-affiliated institutions. Writers such as Geoffrey Chaucer in England and Dante in Italy began to produce significant literary works in their respective vernaculars. Dramatic arts, heretofore largely concerned with biblical allegories, now featured secular themes and humanistic interests. And of course, in the realm of sculpture, painting, and architecture, the wealth made possible by the commercial revolution and growing trans-regional trade networks meant that patronage of the arts no longer relied on the largesse of the church. The secular funding of the arts allowed a degree of artistic freedom, and out of that freedom grew an increasingly sophisticated artistic and cultural sensibility. Question 8. What would be the long-term significance of John Wycliffe and Jan Hus? The increase in commercial activity in the wake of the Crusades enriched not only private individuals, but the Catholic Church as well. Bishops, cardinals, and popes began to live ostentatious lives that would rival those of the most decadent kings and princes, living in palaces and patronizing the arts in addition to more salacious indulgences. Not only this, the Church itself was becoming increasingly involved in secular political affairs, either as an intermediary or on its own behalf. Many would-be reformers took exception to what they saw as a neglect of the Church's core religious mission. In England, John Wycliffe, a religious scholar, attacked the privileges of the Catholic clergy and urged more attention be paid to ordinary religious interests. Amongst other reform proposals, he advocated for translating the Bible into English to make it more accessible to lay people. His followers attacked other aspects of the Church, including the preeminence of the Pope himself. Wycliffe, in turn, inspired a Czech priest, Jan Hus, whose work similarly decried the moral failings of the clergy and the political preoccupations of the Pope. Hus's ideas spread rapidly throughout Northern and Central Europe, regions where resentment of the papacy was particularly high. Neither Wycliffe nor Huss were able to bring about systemic change within the Catholic Church. Both movements were ultimately suppressed by a combination of ecclesiastical and secular force. Wycliffe would be declared a heretic after his death, and Huss would be burned at the stake. Ironically, the failure of their movements was due in part to the very thing they had railed against: ecclesiastical participation in secular politics. Simply put, the Church wielded so much political power that no European state dared to embrace Wycliffe or Huss. Politics and perspectives would shift, however, and because the next wave of reforms, led by Martin Luther, coincided with secular political opposition to the Catholic establishment, the result was true change in the form of the Protestant Reformation. It is interesting to speculate whether Wycliffe or Huss would have approved of political implementation of the very reforms they proposed. Question 9. There is a theme in this episode of hostility on the part of the ruling establishment towards merchants and bankers. Why is this? Think about the socio-economic structure and rationale of feudalism. Where do merchants and bankers fit in this system? And how does the treatment of merchants and bankers illustrate the limits of feudalism? Feudalism is, at its core, a system for supporting and facilitating a warrior elite. Given the technological and geographical limitations on both aggressor and defender in the Middle Ages, it was natural that a heavily armed and armored elite would be the core of a state's military power. To finance and support this warrior class, the only constant source of economic activity at this time, agriculture, had to be subordinated to this purpose. Thus, military power was directly linked to agricultural output, which in turn required land ownership. For most of human history, this meant that those who controlled the land retained power and authority. This is the basis for a landed aristocracy. The centuries following the Crusades and the Mongols disrupted this socio-economic order. The trans-regional trade networks that had waxed and waned from the time of the Romans onward were now indelibly established. The innovations in accounting and banking, combined with the growing appetite for luxury goods from the East, fueled an increasingly profitable merchant industry. There now was a source of wealth, and therefore power, that did not require the extensive land ownership that historically had been exclusive to the aristocracy. This posed an obvious existential threat to nobles across Europe, and so the commercial sector was subject to disdain, if not outright hostility, from the established powers of the time. This was a precursor to the ultimate death blow to European aristocracies, the Industrial Revolution. Question 10. How did the Black Death disrupt the prevailing socio-economic order of the time? Western Europe's social and economic structure was deeply shaken in the middle of the 14th century by the devastation of the bubonic plague, which arrived in Europe through commercial contacts with the Near and Far East. Beginning in 1347, and then returning cyclically for decades, the Black Death would kill a third of the total European population, reversing previous growth trends and causing massive shock and dislocation. Many people sought to flee the cities, where the contagion was most obvious, but the economic impact and therefore socio-political disruption would ultimately be felt more acutely in rural areas. Labor supplies were disrupted. With workers in short supply, many sought to improve wages or working conditions to offset the shortage of workers. At the same time, some landlords and other employers were trying to impose new burdens, triggering massive rural protests that erupted in several regions in France and Britain during the 14th century. Peasants sought to reduce the burdens of serfdom and gain fuller access to the land, and many urban workers demanded higher wages. Over time, the Black Death and the consequential social upheaval had three structural results. First, for some peasants, serfdom was loosened. Many peasants were able to convert their annual payments and labor obligations into monthly rent, which was often easier to handle. Economic activity grew faster than the populations, so the overall quality of life, while still relatively low, nonetheless gradually increased. Less labor intensive economic activities, such as urban manufacturing, gained ground on an agricultural economy predicated on a massive peasant labor pool. And finally, for several reasons, the European economy could no longer support the extended families that had characterized pre Black Death Europe. People were now marrying later and having fewer children, and this new emphasis on more compact family units heralded an era of sexual repression that saw sex become a taboo subject, heavily regulated by families and church alike.